This podcast is something you may need to make it through the long and complicated essay I'm posting for you at the address shown here. The basic idea is that travel is something that has many lookalikes, but authentic travel is key to understanding the inner nature of subjectivity. It's about the space and time the subject lives in, and although not all subjects become travelers, those who discover the art of authentic traveling come to terms with their own subjectivity by realizing that the space and time of travel reveal a hidden or latent virtuality. I can't just lay out this argument in any normal way. I have to recognize that from the start, even those in the audience who have sophisticated philosophy training are unlikely to understand what I'm saying. I have to take blame for this, but I have a tradition to fall back on. I'm told that when mathematicians face a difficult problem, instead of trying to approach that problem rationally, they make up a completely ridiculous theory that they call the Ersatz conjecture. It's a theory that is very unlikely to explain the problem at hand. They apply it to the problem just to see what happens. It's almost certain that 99% of the conjecture will be wrong, which is fine. The negative error data helps to restructure the next attempt. But in the 1% off chance that the theory gets a lucky strike, a lot is learned. Against the odds, the ridiculous theory has uncovered something that the theorist never expected to be there. This is a secret not just about the part of the unknown problem, but a secret about the structure of the problem. It's not a particular truth, but a truth about truth. I didn't start out wanting to be irrational. When I first looked at the problem of travel in relation to architecture, I suggested looking at the work of Henry Johnstone. In the 1980s, he published an analysis of Homer's Odyssey, which is a story about an ancient traveler who dawdled around the Mediterranean before returning to his home in Ithaca. Johnstone used Homer's text to isolate 9 cases where real travel could deteriorate. These seem to be empirical observations about Odysseus's experience, which is funny because Johnstone was a famous idealist philosopher. So part of my Ersatz conjecture was, are these so-called categories of travel just things about travel, or do they constitute a kind of system? The first important thing about the categories is something easy to overlook. It defines travel in terms of things distinguished from each other. Distinction itself is a kind of travel precept, so I added a category to Johnstone's system and called it the gap. The gap is something that has to be kept open if the traveler isn't to be swamped by the demands of travel. We all know situations when, say, we have our luggage or wallet stolen, we're tired or hungry, and it starts to rain. Or you get arrested and thrown into jail. That's saturation. The gap expands in 2 directions. First, it's about the relation between accumulation of travel experiences, a kind of inbox of travel experience, and the corresponding outbox, the control that travel requires to keep moving. The gap then expands downward to the contrast of suffering with curiosity, an obvious contrast. These play out with the addition of 2 more pairs that you see on the bottom row. The real question is, do these distinctions turn Johnstone's categories from being a list to being some kind of system, some kind of logic? If we defined each, it's tempting just to keep them as a stack of concerns or points of view on what makes travel really travel. However, when you look at the definitions, I would argue that you can see a pattern where the traveler, the subjective end of travel, must come to terms with the objective end, the world of travel. Finally, the case of the true traveler is not being either subjective or objective. The true traveler identifies with the whole of travel, which is more of a circuit that simultaneously contains and divides. I borrow from Susan Buck Morse's interesting idea about how the nervous system doesn't end at the brainstem, but continues through the whole body to the skin and tips of our fingers and toes. But it doesn't stop there either. It continues out into the world where the body's energies are tested against the resistances offered by the objective world. My Ersatz conjecture takes a leap here. The subject goes into the object world to test itself, to apply a subjective measure of things, but it gets back an objective account of how it is present in the world. The circuit is like a circle that contains a space, but the center point is how the circle is formed. If you can think of circling rather than just the circle as a finished product, you can see how the central point is something that is both in the middle and on the circumference. This is the first suggestion we get that authentic travel might be a kind of geometry problem. Buck Morse goes on to say that contrast between the body and the world is something of a fiction, because what is real or actual in this case is the circuit that's established by sensory extension and movement. The subject moves across the world as a figure on a ground. It's a kind of figure ground situation, in fact. What she calls a synesthetic system suggests that this figure ground could reverse into a ground figure situation, and that the divide between the subjective body and the objective world is not a simple line, but a more complicated gap, less of a simple distinction or an enclosure, and more of a combination of both enclosing and dividing. This complex inside-outside boundary situation connects to some curious things. The first is not just uncanny, it is the uncanny, as described by the German psychologist Ernst Jentsch. He said that the uncanny could be boiled down to two primary conditions: the dead person who is not paying attention to the fact that he or she is dead, and the living person who flees from death but ends up running straight into death's waiting open arms. This sort of corresponds to the way we think of subjects as living and moving around, and the world filled with objects that, even if they are not exactly dead, are going to stay put so that we can move around them. This is another figure ground contrast that ends up giving way to a reversal, because these two types of uncanny are really mirror images of each other. The gap is even more complicated when we disconnect the most subjective thing we can think of, which is knowing, from the subject and make it objective. This actually happened when Sir Francis Galton went to a country fair and watched a raffle for a prize cow. Anyone who could guess the exact weight of the cow could take it home and eat it. No one guessed the right weight, so the cow survived, at least for a while. Galton wondered, however, if the wrong guesses might tell him something. He asked for the raffle tickets and went home to calculate the average of all the wrong guesses. To his surprise, the average was exactly the right number. This experiment is repeated in psychology classes with a jar of jelly beans. Presumably it's better for vegetarians and also the professor who doesn't have to take a cow to class. Needless to say, the cow is very grateful. But the main point is that if there was a correct guess, then whatever produced this must have been a kind of mind that emerged from the collective ignorance of the people who made the wrong guesses. This was a great moment for Ersatz theory, because the wrong answers were actually essential to come up with the right answer. It turns out that this kind of knowing has been known for a long time. The Greek word kenosis is about the way of knowing that arises out of our ignorance or our unconsciousness. It means that we can go directly to the objective world as long as we relax our desire to be in control. This makes emergence an important aspect of authentic travel. I have another idea about emergence that relates it more to architecture by showing how our ordinary day-to-day experience expands into a different kind of virtuality from the Euclidean kind. where perspective makes us think we are a figure running across the ground. The premise of this conjecture is that the human subject is divided in the first place by the idea of the mirror. We define ourselves by how we appear to others, and the only index of appearing comes from our mirror images. However, the mirror cuts space into two parts. A full circle becomes two 180-degree half circles. If we imagine Waldo as our subject, we can see something that Waldo won't see. Waldo is Waldo because he dresses and looks like Waldo, the Waldo that everybody else can recognize. I might say that Waldo doesn't get a day off in this respect. Waldo carries his mirror with him. It's what makes him think that he's the same Waldo from one day to the next, from one place to any other he might want to travel. For instance, Waldo in France is still Waldo. But by carrying a mirror with him, when Waldo goes around the circle, he is only making half the trip. He thinks he is back in position, but he is in a reverse orientation. Waldo doesn't like this very much, so he must mentally add back the missing 180 degrees by including all of the things subtracted by the mirror. Or we can think of Euclidean space as mirror-like in that every appearance conceals something. Appearance is balanced out by disappearance. It's a zero-sum game. When Waldo mentally completes himself because he doesn't understand the non-orientation of his upside-down Waldo person, he unconsciously must reverse his figure-ground relationships. In the world of latent virtuality, he is paralyzed instead of being a moving figure. He is a fixed figure and the ground has to move around him. This is actually what happens when Waldo dreams. His body is kept in place by dreams that shield him from disturbances that would wake him up. This is like what in computer science is called idempotency, the power or ability to keep the operating system the same when some hackers make what is called a denial of service attack. This is when a website is flooded by demands to produce something in hopes of shutting down the system. The dream functions like an idempotency algorithm by incorporating the leading edge of an external disturbance into the dream and turning the attack on itself using a mirror image of the attacks, a kind of palindrome that will match up perfectly with whatever comes in. There is much more to say about idempotency and figure ground reversals, so go read the full paper. The connections between travel and dreaming and works of art where dreaming is simulated are very important. If you want to get into it, you should look into the proper mathematical relations between non-orientation and self-intersection, and the topology of projective surfaces such as the Klein bottle, the Mobius band, and the Borromeo knot. If you are not mathematically minded, you may not get too far, but at least you may come to understand how projective geometry is something more basic than Euclidean geometry, which gives us our derivative pictures of everyday experience. The sleeper needs to have these pictures, so the dream keeps the dreamer from realizing he or she is paralyzed by moving the ground across the figure. This sounds a bit crazy at first, but it connects us to other crazy things, like the surrealism in art that inspired Magritte to paint his famous work called Not to be Reproduced, of a man returning to his origin point but finding that the mirror refuses to cooperate. He has tapped into the latent space of the mirror, a space lying behind the mirror's obligation to return the 180 degrees it mechanically has seen and recorded. This latency can be pulled past the 180-degree limit and stored for later use. When the new subject comes back to the mirror, it's like Waldo, who was quite surprised to find that the latent space is like kenosis. It's a way of seeing without seeing, knowing without knowing.